Newswatch into Labor's crazy election promise to stop China making security deals with Pacific countries by broadcasting the ABC to the region and make the Pacific Islanders prefer us, like us more. Former Labor Prime Minister Kevin Rudd said, yes, China has spent $9 billion enhancing its own global media influence since 2009. But meanwhile, he complains Liberal governments axe both Australian network TV and shortwave radio in the Pacific. It axed Australia's voice into the Solomons. That's Rudd's complaint, but like a lot of things, it's not actually true. Not entirely, because the Abbott government, yes, it did axe the ABC's Australian network, but now that same job is done by Pacific Australia, which sends free Australian content all around the Pacific, including Neighbours, the NRL, cricket, MasterChef, The Voice. Who wouldn't like us? Which makes me wonder, why is Labor angling to get the ABC to do that job? Because when I look at the ABC, the picture it often paints of Australia, and let's see this footage again, because it's all stuff from ABC broadcasts.
I do find Australia ultimately a racist country. The fact that white settlers came here and killed so many Aborigines.
The Australian flag, to me, has now become... I identify that with racism. Does anyone else?
Well, white people are...
White people are...
Well, I've never actually met a white person, but I do agree. White people, they're...
Violence against Aboriginal women has been happening from basically colonisation.
Meanwhile, what we're up against is a Chinese media that doesn't do that kind of thing about China, painted as terrible. No, it's invested that $9 billion into its foreign broadcasting in networks like CGTN, for instance. Shows that give, the dictator giving lectures on how good China is and how peaceful. And then it has interviews with people who say how rotten the West is, people like us.
When there is coverage of the Western media, there's often a kind of racist, patronizing perspective that portrays countries in the global South as authoritarian, in scare quotes, and portrays the West as supposedly democratic.
This Chinese state media is also very keen to say how terrible Australia is.
Asian Australian groups are calling on the government to do more to stop an increase in racist attacks. They say the pandemic and the deteriorating relationship between Australia and China are fueling the problem.
Actually, that sounds a bit like an ABC broadcast. Joining me is Jack Houghton, digital editor here at Sky News and presenter of The Media Show every Friday at 8 p.m. Jack, Labor does look like becoming the next government. So this is the proposal that worries me. Why is it so keen to get the ABC broadcasting in the Pacific, and especially when we've already got Pacific Australia doing that job?
Yeah, it's very interesting, and I know exactly what they're doing as well. They're courting the ABC journalists and essentially saying, well, if you support us, if you give us an easy transition in, we will increase the reach. And it concerns me for a couple of reasons. First, I think the ABC is on a path of increasing commercialisation, trying to compete against commercial bodies, and that shouldn't be its purpose. The ABC is barely able to surface the regional areas. They're always saying we don't have enough staff to cover these key stories in regional seats, etc., let alone playing the role as the voice in the Pacific. But also, you raised some really good points already tonight by saying that the ABC, some of the programming, is not necessarily something that Australians would want representative of who is Australian. All you're going to get is the Solomon Islands seeing, every 10 seconds how Australians are racist or sexist and how evil we are. There is a degree of self-loathing which creeps into the ABC, and I don't necessarily think it's a positive export to be delivering.
Yeah, but I also think you make a point. The ABC really should be there for market failure, not to replace another organisation. In this case, Pacific Australia is already doing that job. What do you make of the kind of shows that Pacific Australia does send out to the Pacific at the moment?
Well, I definitely think there is a weakness there. It does appear to be a syndication agreement with Channel 10 and 7. You get programs such as The Project, which are then pushed out into this area. Again, the same kinds of narratives being formed that Australians are sexist, are racist, etc. So, look, I think if you wanted to make a case that there should be more broadcasting into the area, maybe the Bolt Report, maybe Sky News, maybe they should be looking at a proper mainstream service, because I don't think you're getting that with The Project, and I think their dwindling viewership numbers prove that.
Well, yeah, I think so. Now, on past performance, I don't expect the ABC to be doing all the stuff that I've just suggested it might, and maybe it would be more temperate, I don't know. But on past performance, what do you expect the ABC to be sending to the Pacific if Labor gets in, which it looks likely, and gives them this job? Is it that we're going to be racist and global warming is spells doom for the Pacific and Australia's not doing enough and all that? Or do you expect something a little more constructive?
Well, Andrew, one of the biggest failures of journalistic coverage, I think, this election has been the failure to prosecute the weaknesses in Labor's arguments that this deal is predicated on Australia's weakness on climate policy. The worst offenders have been the ABC. So we're effectively arguing for the national broadcaster to be putting out content into the Pacific saying it's false, saying that Australia's failure to address climate change has encouraged this deal with China, when we know that China is the largest emitter. It's twice as large as the second place behind it. It's absolutely insane. It doesn't meet any kind of logic that they would turn to the largest emitter of CO2 in the world to make some kind of philosophical point against Australia's policies. Yet that has been a legitimate talking point by the likes of Penny Wong and Anthony Albanese, and egregiously it's just been picked up, not critically, but just churned out there by the ABC as if that is a legitimate talking point. Do we want that put out through the Pacific, where these ideas should be debated and contested, where there's immense complexity, and instead it's just being trivialised as being, well, Australia was weak on climate change and the Pacific is going to suffer from climate change, therefore they don't like us anymore. I find the narrative childish, and I was very disappointed with how the ABC covered the topic.
I think that's an excellent point, because it drove me nuts that until last year, when they finally did a fact check, obviously expecting a different answer, they used to say the Pacific Islands are drowning, Vanuatu is drowning and rising seas, global warming. They did a fact check. I mean, I was telling them for years this was false, and they finally admitted it last year. But up to that point, they would have been scaring the hell out of so many Pacific Islanders, many of whom still think their islands are drowning, when in fact something like 86% are either growing or stable. So, how long does it take the ABC to actually tell the truth about global warming? Well, Jack Houghton, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks very much for having me, Andrew.